Hello. Noah's Ark has been rediscovered in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat. It's 158 meters in length, and Noah's Ark is buried 4 to 11 meters under the surface of the gorge at elevations between 3,900 and 4,700 meters above sea level. It certainly is Noah's Ark. First of all, this archaeological site dates to 13,100 to 9,600 BC, or the last stages of what they call the late Epipaleolithic period. The interior is filled with utilitarian artifacts, wood scoops, stone pestles, wood mortars, wood vessels covered with clay material and burned, the early precursors of pottery. The interior is filled with cages for animals, anywhere from 20 centimeters in width to over 4 meters in width. This archaeological site is covered on the exterior and on the interior with bitumen or petroleum-based pitch, similar to early Neolithic vessels at the Kuwaiti site of Asabia during the early Neolithic. Also, there are sloping ramps that lead to the animal cages. And these animal cages are filled with not any skeletal material, but every type of non-skeletal byproduct. Everything from arachnid webs to feathers to hair to animal feces. Also, this site is definitely a maritime barge, in that the exterior of the hull angles inward to the central keel. Also, there's a lot of evidence for cross beams throughout the different elevations of the walls to keep the hull intact. Also, there's lots of evidence for maritime joinery, specifically coke and dowel or mortise and tenon joinery throughout the vessel. In addition, the barge has large cargo holds that are filled with early types of legumes, namely sisser, chickpea, pisum, pea, and vicia urvilia, or bitter vetch, which is not common today, but was very common during the transition between the late Epipaleolithic and the pre-pottery Neolithic. So this is a wonderful site representing the transition between the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene, the end of the Stone Age and beginning of the Farming Age, and the end of the late Epipaleolithic period and the beginning of the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. So just so valuable for both science and faith. The site accommodates all the requirements, all the criteria that are mentioned in Genesis, chapters 5 through 10, by the Babylonian scholar Berosus. Now that the site has been separated, it was 158 meters when it was put together, but is now in an area that covers 2 stadia in width and 5 stadia in length, following the requirements of the Babylonian scholar Berosus. Also, according to Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian, Noah's Ark is braced with cross beams throughout the interior and has plenty of evidence for bitumen on the vessel, which Josephus says is that Roman legionnaires took the little bits of bitumen to make little talismans during classical times. The site also fulfills one of the mentions in an account associated with Alexander the Great, in that during the summer, the site is located in the midst of an expanse of water when the glacial ice melts in pools at the bottom of the highest plateau in the southern gorge. Also in the Quran, the Islamic prophet Muhammad mentions that the vessel confronted waves as high as mountains. And it's interesting that all along both the starboard and port side, there are ballast features comprising horizontal cypress timbers in front of a linear mass of boulders, but these boulders are from the Levant and comprise sandstone and coral and other sedimentary rock that are totally different from the volcanic lithic material from Greater Mount Ararat. So not only does this site fulfill all the requirements for a maritime barge, but it also fulfills all the requirements in classical archaeology from these ancient texts from Genesis, Berosus, Josephus, Muhammad, and also by a text associated with Alexander the Great. So all of these show very clearly that this archaeological site is Noah's Ark. Now, at the end state of last discussion, we talked about several tragic results. Number one, the Armenian guides had carried in 1907 at the direction of Catholicos Mkurtic Crimean up to 1,500 artifacts from in the interior of Noah's Ark and also at the small worship areas near the entrances of Noah's Ark to what is now the Republic of Georgia. It was then the Kingdom of Georgia. The question remains, as some of you have asked, is that why didn't these Armenian guides just carry the artifacts across the border due east to Etchmiadzin or Yerevan in Armenia because it was so close? Well, there's 4 reasons why they didn't. First, remember 1907 was after the Hamidian massacre, where Sultan Abdul Hamid II said that anyone who was not a Muslim, including the entire Armenian population, Kurdish militia could simply take their lands, take their property, take their valuables, and simply kill the Armenians if they refuse to become Muslim. The principal agent in eastern Turkey, or the Armenians referred to as Western Armenia, was the Hamidiye cavalry. These were light horsemen that comprised mostly Kurdish clans. And what the light horsemen were especially focused on was the area between Yerevan and Etchmiadzin and Mount Ararat. So this was particularly heavily invested by the Hamidiye cavalry. And what Mkurtic Crimean did not want is these cavalry to abscond and take artifacts from Noah's Ark, from the former guides to Noah's Ark that were carrying these artifacts. So Catholicos Crimean did not want to risk losing the artifacts. The second reason that the Noah's Ark guides took the artifacts to the Kingdom of Georgia was as they moved north, the area was primarily in control by the Russian Empire. So there was more Russian forces that would be able to protect them while they were moving the artifacts into the Kingdom of Georgia that had very significant control by the Russian Empire. The third reason that Catholicos Crimean wanted the Ark artifacts in the Kingdom of Georgia was the rise of Marxism. Stepan Shahumian had already established the first Marxist center in Stepanovan, which is in northern Armenia. And Marxist revolutionaries had heavily invested some of the Armenian militias, specifically Dashnak. And the Dashnak were heavily influenced by many socialists. And so the last thing that Mkurtic Crimean wanted is socialists and Marxists to know about the Noah's Ark artifacts. Another reason is that Yerevan and Etchmiadzin had already been invested by many socialist student groups. Remember, Anastas Mikoyan, a good friend of Joseph Stalin, started the revolutionary communist organization in the seminary in Etchmiadzin. So by that time, Yerevan and Etchmiadzin had thoroughly been invested in the seminary level and at the Catholicos level by individuals that were Marxists or socialists. So McCurtich Crimean, by ordering all the artifacts to go to the Kingdom of Georgia, avoided the Marxist influence that was already Yerevan and Etchmiadzin, avoided the Marxist contingents, and avoided the Kurdish cavalry of the Hamidiye forces. And these families that used to be guides to Noah's Ark were able to successfully transport the artifacts from Noah's Ark to the Kingdom of Georgia. The second scenario that's very depressing and very sad was the Armenian Genocide. And this lasted from 1915 to 1916, and then with the Turkish War of Independence from 1919 to 1923. And this was a terrible ordeal for the Armenians, which resulted in the death of approximately 1.5 million Armenians, according to most scholars. And the Ottoman Turks and their Kurdish militia did this through a death march by cannibalizing Armenian civilians and forcing them to march without food or without water to the northern deserts of Syria, dying along the way. Some of you have asked, well, why didn't they put them in labor battalions? Or why wasn't there a concentration camp? Or why wasn't there just a mass grave within the borders of Turkey? Why did they subject them to the death march? Well, there were several reasons for this. And one of the principal issues is that many anthropologists and historians don't like second or third hand information. But this is crucial in learning about the Armenian Genocide, simply because many of the Ghazi, or the original veterans from World War I that were responsible for these massacres and for the genocide, did not communicate except to their sons and then their grandsons that are now in the Turkish military. And Armenian and Turkish and Georgian anthropologists and historians can learn so much from these individuals. Even though it's not primary information, at least it's secondary information and tertiary information, but it reveals so much about the Armenian Genocide. And what they revealed is this: the reason for the death marches was to lessen the evidence for the mass killings. Remember, the Hamidian massacre had just happened, which was responsible for lessening the power of Abdul Hamid II. So now that the Committee of Union and Progress had taken over and the Young Turk Revolution had occurred in 1908, what the three leaders, which were Enver Pasha, Kemal Pasha, and Talat Pasha, the three generals, didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the Hamidian massacre. They didn't want to have photos of mass graves. Also, by having the death marches, people would die along the way. And the area was still so inundated by events during World War I that a collection of bones here and there did not provide much evidence for mass killing, because these would be readily picked apart by dogs, vultures, and crows, so there would be less evidence. The second reason is because the entire region of eastern Turkey was starving. There was mass starvation of not only the Turkish majority, but also the Kurdish minority. And concentration camps would require food and water to be brought to these victims. The Turkish leaders' reason is that there was no availability for food and water, and they couldn't provision these concentration camps with these needed items. Instead, they wanted the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Syrian Christians to die. One of the frequent comments by the Turkish Ghazi that the officers said to their men was a phrase, onlar mı yoksa biz mi? Them or us. And what the officers said to their men was, listen, we either do this, we either accomplish this mission and kill these individuals, or who do you want to starve? Do you want your anne, your mother, to starve? Your kız kardeş, your sister, to starve? Your eş, your wife, to starve? Because there was not enough resources to feed these Christians. And so the orders were to eliminate these individuals to preserve the Muslim populations, specifically the Turks and the Kurdish populations within Anatolia. Another reason that the Armenian genocide was different from the Nazi genocide of the Jews is that in Armenia, it wasn't a center where there was manufacturing or they needed grand building projects. No, this was an area of pastoralism, sheep and goat or caprine herding and agriculture. So there was no need for giant corvée labor or slave labor. Also, this area was starving. It was unlike in Nazi Germany, where no matter how the war went on, Germans could still eat. In this area in eastern Turkey, the Kurdish and the Turkish populations were starving. So it was not reasonable to have these individuals used as slave labor because there was no engineering products. This area was generally poor, and this area was generally covered by caprine pastoralism. So again, there was no need for slave labor or a concentration camp. In essence, the goal was to kill these populations. Another idea was that the Armenian women were used as sexual slaves. No, it was far worse than that. Yes, they were raped, but then after they were raped, they were either put back on the death march or they were just simply killed. Very few individuals sheltered these women or protected these women or brought these women into their homes. And there was no slavery simply because the entire region was starving. So the Armenian genocide is very different from the Nazi concentration camps or the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews. Another reason is that the Turks and the Kurds would not have to owe Armenian lenders any of their money. Their debts would simply go away with the extermination of the Armenian populations. Also, the Turkish leaders told many of the Kurdish clan leaders, we can't pay you, but what we can do is we can offer this quid pro quo. When you capture Armenian lands, when you capture Armenian people and valuables, you can keep the lands. You can keep the valuables. And this encouraged the Kurdish populations to not only eliminate or participate in the genocide of the Armenians in eastern Turkey, but then take over their lands. And one of the requirements for pastoralism is land. And the ideal state is to have enough land where you and your clan can conduct caprine, sheep or goat pastoralism and not have to travel all over the place, but could just reside on your lands to feed your herds. And so all of these things were used in the Armenian genocide by the Kurdish militia and the Turkish forces. And three individuals, three generals, or what they call Pasha, were instrumental. First, Enver Pasha. He was the war minister of the Committee of Union and Progress. Second, Talat Pasha. He was the minister of the Interior and responsible for coordination of the death marches. And lastly, Kemal Pasha, or Kemal Pasha, not to be confused with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, but Kemal Pasha was the governor of Syria and commander of the Fourth Army. And these three generals, these three leaders, the war minister of Enver Pasha, the minister of the Interior or the Grand Vizier of Talat Pasha, and the governor of Syria or Kemal Pasha worked together to exact to continue this Armenian genocide. The third aspect of this is Armenian revenge. And Turks and Kurdish populations are frustrated because everyone is knowledgeable about the Armenian genocide, but very few know about the Armenian revenge. And the revenge started with the Caucasus campaign. The Armenians were horrified and tried to get across the border, and some of them were able to get into the border, into the oblasts of the Russian Empire. But then what the Russians did during World War I is they counterattacked. These attacks comprised what they call the Caucasus campaigns. Now, everyone has heard about the German and the Austrian, Hungarian Eastern Front against the Russians, but few people know about the Caucasus campaigns. And here, what happened is in 1914 to 1918, there was a huge advance by the Russian Empire into Anatolia, or Ottoman Turkey, culminating with the Battle of Sarıkamış. But Sarıkamış was not a battle or a localized battle. It was a broad offensive that went through nearly the entire length of eastern Turkey, where the Russian Empire and Armenian militia advanced, and in this case, hundreds of thousands of Turkish military and Kurdish militia were killed. And not only were they killed, but then the local populations of the Kurds and the Turks were also killed or subject to starvation when the Russian Imperial Army just took all their stores, and the Armenian militia exacted revenge for the genocide that was happening to their population. And this culminated in the Battle of Erzurum, where Russian forces not only defeated the forts, but then invested Erzurum, causing, again, tremendous loss of Turkish and Kurdish lives, and not only of the soldiers, but also of the civilians. And this happened from January to February 1916. So this was the principal point of revenge. So these campaigns were entirely successful. But what stopped this forward momentum by the Russian army and the Armenian militia? The Bolshevik Revolution. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution started under Lenin, and the entire advance collapsed, and what was left was Armenian militia and the army of the Caucasus that was undermanned by the new Soviet Union that were there to prevent countermeasures by Turkish forces and Kurdish militia. And they were ill-equipped, they were undermanned, and the Turks and the Kurds overcame the Russian lines and then pressed onward. And during this time, not only was there tremendous upheaval in the military, but also the generals were very opportunistic. They did not want to stop on what was former Soviet lines. What they wanted to do was continue their advances whenever there was weakness. And one of the weaknesses and very strong potential was the oil fields of Baku. The Soviet forces were very ill prepared, and the Turks, under the Committee of Union and Progress, invaded Baku, and they were only repulsed by combined forces of the Soviet Union and the Armenians under who? Well, one of them was the Lenin of the Caucasus, Stepan Shahumian, that we just talked about, that prevented Catholicos Crimean from taking the artifacts from Noah's Ark directly into Armenia. But he lost his life during the defense of Baku. But here, the Soviet forces, plus their Armenian allies, were able to defeat the Azeris or the Azerbaijanis, and this advance from Turkey. So again, this was a very fluid arrangement, where at first you had the Turks and the Kurdish militia advancing throughout eastern Turkey, then the Russians advancing into the interior of Anatolia. And then when the Bolshevik Revolution started in 1917, you had the return of the Turkish and the Kurdish militia advancing again, this time all the way to the oil fields of Baku. So again, a tremendous period of death and destruction and starvation throughout World War I and the Turkish War of Independence that lasted until 1923. After the Battle of Baku in 1918, which results in a loss for the Turkish government, for the Committee of Union and Progress by the Soviet Union, and also heavily manned by Dashnak, Armenian militia, Turkey experiences the rise in earnest of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Atatürk leads the Congress at Siva, calls for the National Assembly in 1920, and is proclaimed in 1921 as not only the first speaker, but also the leader and also the commander-in-chief of what is going to be in 1923 the new Republic of Turkey. Now, who is funding this? Who is funding what they call the Kemalist forces? It's the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin. And why is that? Because Soviet leaders believed that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was in essence a Marxist. He had intimated that he was a secularist, which was definitely true. But he also intimated that he was part of the proletariat and that he had Marxist leanings and believed Marxist and Leninist theory. And so the Soviet Union contributed much gold and armaments to his forces during the Turkish War of Independence. This culminated in two treaties between Turkey and the Soviet Union, led by Lenin and Stalin. Number one, the Treaty of Moscow in March of 1921, followed by the Treaty of Kars in October of 1921. And here, because Stalin and Lenin believed that Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was in essence a secularist, if not a communist, they allowed him to have Kars and the area around Greater Mount Ararat as being part of the Republic of Turkey. And this was very instrumental because this kept Noah's Ark on Greater Mount Ararat in secularist Muslim hands and out of the purview, the reach of the Armenians, especially any traditionalist Armenians that were resistant to Marxist and secularist beliefs of the Bolshevik Revolution. But as soon as these treaties were concluded, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk showed his true colors. He immediately published in newspapers in Turkey that Soviet leaders misunderstood. He was not a communist. He was pro-Turkey. He wanted what was best for the entire Turkish and Muslim populations. Then what happened is he began a cult of personality where everyone in Turkey, in their homes and in their offices and in their shops, had to have an image of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. But not only this, what was happening right after the Treaty of Kars and the Treaty of Moscow, remember there were three generals that were left from the Committee of Union and Progress: Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Kemal Pasha. And these individuals fled to Germany, at least Kemal and Talat Pasha did. But Enver Pasha went to the Soviet Union and convinced them to have him help put down what they called the Basmachi revolt in Uzbekistan. And this was a center of pan-Islamic belief in the Ummah al-Islam, that Islam was going to take over and the different nations of Islam would unite and overthrow Western and Soviet thought and Marxist-Leninist polities. Also at the time, this was a part of pan-Turkic beliefs, where Turkish Muslims would unite and overthrow Western and Soviet polities. So this was the worst combination for the Soviet Union. Well, Enver Pasha was sent by Lenin and Stalin to put down the revolt. But what did Enver Pasha do? He joined the revolutionaries, the Basmachi revolt, and started leading the revolt. So here you have the worst of two scenarios. You have Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in charge of Turkey, following a cult of personality where everyone has to pay obeisance to him. And then on the other side in Uzbekistan, you have Enver Pasha leading the Basmachi revolt of this pan-Islam, pan-Turkic movement. And so the worst case for the Soviet Union. And it would only take Mustafa Kemal Atatürk to find out about Noah's Ark to unite all Muslims, the entire Ummah al-Islam, and then they would have a serious threat on the borders of the Soviet Union. So this is what led to the extermination of the laity, the chair of archaeology, Professor Kalantar, and the Catholicos Koran I Murad Bekian being garroted to death, simply because the Soviet Union could not risk Mustafa Kemal Atatürk using Noah's Ark as a launching point for a pan-Islam, pan-Turkic movement to unite all of Islam and invade the borders of the Soviet Union. So in 1937, as Stalin really doubted Yezhov's ability because one of his ministers had abdicated to the Empire of Japan, which was a terrible blow for the Soviet Union. So Stalin sent his most trusted individuals, namely Anastas Mikoyan and Melenkov, who was eventually to succeed Stalin when he died, to Armenia to make sure that everyone that was a traditionalist that knew about Noah's Ark would die. And it was interesting, in 1937, Anastas Mikoyan arrived, and as soon as he arrived, he asked Stalin to add 800 people more to the death list, and you wonder why. Well, there were so many people that knew about Noah's Ark, and they needed to be eliminated. Just think, in the last several months, over 100,000 people have seen Noah's Ark data videos. And all of you know, because I started with each lecture, where Noah's Ark is in the southern gorge of Greater Mount Ararat, between 39 and 4,700 meters above sea level, buried 4 to 11 meters under the surface of the southern gorge. Well, that was a recipe to get you killed or liquidated during the Great Purge from 1930 to 1938 if you were Armenian or you had ties to the Catholicos and knew about Noah's Ark. So Anastas Mikoyan felt he needed this increase in individuals to eliminate any possibility that the information on Noah's Ark would come out, especially to make sure that Atatürk didn't know about the location of Noah's Ark, so that he couldn't use this as part of a pan-Islamic cult of personality, pan-Turkic fulcrum to unite all Muslim peoples to invade the Soviet Union, miles away from the Soviet border, with the Oblast of Georgia and the Oblast of Armenia being so close. But after the Purge, it's interesting that, as far as I can tell from the people that I've talked to, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk certainly knew about Noah's Ark. But again, he was a secularist, and he felt that a lot of the sheikhs and the religious leaders had kept Ottoman Turkey backward, and he wanted to move the Republic of Turkey into a more modern environment. Especially, he wanted to have women added to the workforce. Also, he wanted to focus on the economic an infrastructure transformation of the Republic of Turkey to be more modern. And he felt he couldn't do that if the Republic of Turkey was cognizant of Noah's Ark and other things that supported the efficacy of some aspects of the Quran. So in 1924, he eliminated the Muslim Caliphate in Turkey. But then what was so concerning to the Soviet Union, in 1927, he arrested all the communists in Turkey. And this caused tremendous alarm within the Soviet Union. And again, added to the impetus for a purge of the Catholicos to prevent any aspect of Noah's Ark being leaked to the Republic of Turkey, and especially to be used by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk against the Soviet Union. Now, another event that correlates with all these events in history is Armenian Revenge. The Republic of Turkey is very hesitant to talk about the Armenian Genocide because they say, well, World War I was just full of death for both sides. And indeed, they are correct. Because remember, after and during the Armenian Genocide was the Caucasus campaign, where the Russian Empire, supplemented with Armenian militia that acted as guides to Russian forces, invaded the eastern part of Turkey, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Turkish soldiers and Kurdish militia, but also the death of millions of civilians. It's estimated that 3.7 million Kurdish people died during World War I, principally of starvation. And this accounts for nearly 14% of their population. But the Armenians were not satisfied because the genocide was so terrible. And so not only there was the resulting death of millions of Kurds and millions of Turks, both the military and civilians, but then after the war and after the genocide, Armenian assassins ensured that the individuals that were responsible for the genocide were assassinated. Number one, Talat Pasha, the minister of the interior that was responsible for canalizing Armenians into those death marches, was assassinated by an Armenian. Number two, Kemal Pasha, who was the governor of Syria that received so many Armenians only to die in the northern deserts of Syria, was again killed by Armenian assassin. Number three, Enver Pasha, the minister of war during World War I, was also killed, but he was killed by Soviet forces and Armenian forces during the Basmachi Revolt, where he sided with the pan-Islamic and pan-Turkic forces against the Soviet Union. So all three individuals died. And this was part and parcel of the general revenge during the Caucasus campaigns, where millions of Kurds and Turks died during and after the Armenian Genocide from 1915 to 1916, and from 1919 to 1923, which comprised the Turkish War of Independence. But there was a final piece that the Armenians used to perfect their revenge. The goal was to keep Noah's Ark concealed so that the Turks and the Kurds in eastern Anatolia would not be able to use Noah's Ark as a pilgrimage center, bringing billions of dollars into that region. Instead, by depriving and concealing Noah's Ark, the entire region would be kept in a much starker regime of poverty compared to Armenia. And in this way, Armenians could seek revenge for the 1.5 million Armenians that died from 1915 to 1923 at the hands of the Turks and the Kurds. By concealing Noah's Ark, Armenians could perfect their revenge by causing millions of Turks and millions of Kurds to die early in higher states of poverty over 100 years. And so to perfect their revenge for the 1.5 million Armenians, tens of millions of Kurds and Turks would die during the past century as a result of the greatest pilgrimage center on earth, Noah's Ark, being concealed from these populations, where they could not benefit from the income and from the stature and from the trade and from the economic surplus that would be caused by the revealing of Noah's Ark. Some of the current Armenians, the descendants of the guides, despite the fact that they know that Noah's Ark has been consistently looted from and is decomposing, they would rather have Noah's Ark be destroyed in its entirety by decomposition and by looting than for the Turks or the Kurdish communities to benefit from Noah's Ark and the entire region to benefit from the profits, income, and from the opportunity that revealing Noah's Ark would create in eastern Turkey. My point is this: after 100 years, this cycle of death and violence is now causing the deletion of history, the deletion of science. Because what we're faced with now is a total loss of information, a total loss of this precious culture and shrine to 3 world religions. Yes, the Armenian Genocide occurred and 1.5 million Armenians died. But this was followed by Armenian Revenge, not only the Caucasus campaigns, but also the elimination of all the leaders for the Committee of Union and Progress, and now the attrition through poverty and through terrorism caused by this poverty of withholding and concealing Noah's Ark from the populations of eastern Turkey, namely the Kurdish and Turkish Muslim populations. This cycle of death has to end. And what Turks and Kurds did to the Armenians, killing 1.5 million of them, has been assuaged by the death of tens of millions of Kurds and Turks during the last century by the Armenians keeping Noah's Ark hidden. Some of the descendants of the guides to Noah's Ark have privately lamented, why did we keep Noah's Ark secret? Because if Noah's Ark had been known at their transition between the 19th and 20th centuries, would Marxism have occurred? Would the rise of Nazism and fascism occurred? But what's definitely occurring now is by concealing the Ark and subjecting it to decomposition and looting, we are destroying history. We are destroying science. And the concealment of Noah's Ark is harming 3 world religions. It has to stop. Both this cycle of violence and this destruction of science, destruction of history, and destruction of religion. By saving Noah's Ark, we are saving history. By saving Noah's Ark, we are saving valuable scientific data about this wonderful culture, the height of technology of the late Stone Age, the late Epipaleolithic, that is encased in this 158-meter barge. And so much information on the transition between the Pleistocene and the Holocene, the transition between the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of the Farming Age, the transition between the end of the late Epipaleolithic period and the beginning of the pre-pottery Neolithic period. And also what we are preserving is a shrine to 3 world religions, the foundational belief of Noah's Ark, which is completely true, found in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Moreover, we are able to, with Noah's Ark, we are able to determine aspects of the archaeology of God and the supernatural, and to have greater clarity of the origins of our civilizations and cultures. Thank you.